Two comments first and then 10 points in 10 minutes. Two comments first. Should we be optimist or pessimist? I think it's an irrelevant question. If I take the example of football or any sport, if you are a supporter, if you look at a match, you can be optimist or pessimist because you wonder who will win. If you are a player, that doesn't matter. You are not optimist or pessimist. You play and you try to win. And in order to win, you try to know who is the best strategy, what is the strength of your partners, the weakness of your contradictors or your opponents. That's exactly my view. We should not be either optimist or pessimist because if you raise the point, that means that you are passive and then you are definitely loser. My second comment is that, to begin with, is that I don't want Europe to be seen as a scapegoat of a crisis. Europe is not at the origin of a crisis. Europe is nothing to do with a crisis. Europe is a victim of a crisis. And as always, when there is a problem somewhere, someone is trying to find a way to move the spotlight elsewhere. It's exactly what the US are doing now, trying to find another scapegoat of a crisis.
Can we raise the volume of the microphone of Mr. Attali,
yes,
please?
I'm sorry. I used to speak with a low voice in order for people to be forced to listen. That's a technique of professor. My 10 points, rapidly. One, we face a huge global challenge worldwide with an enormous potential of growth. Demography is growing, technology is growing, spirit of freedom and democracy and entrepreneurship is growing. No reason now the world is not growing, and actually even with a so-called crisis, the world is growing at a higher speed than nowhere in the past and not at any other period of time. Then we have a potential for huge growth for the next 40 years. But at the same time, we should remember history. And it was also the case in 1910. In 1910, we have also huge growth in demography, a huge growth in democracy, a huge growth in technology, and an amazingly positive world. What happened was a crisis which was linked to the move of a center of the world from the UK empire to the American empire, same kind of things today, and terrorism was called nihilism, a financial crisis, and then what happened? Protectionism. And then in 1910, that was a happy time. Nobody heard about Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mussolini, and others, and it happened. I do believe that we are in that still the same kind of blind optimism where we believe that this will not happen again. It's not true. It happened at least twice. At the end of the 18th century, we also had a huge optimism, and it led to a catastrophe. 25 years of nationalism and wars in Europe, and at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we had also this optimism, and that what? Why? That's my second point. The crisis here began in the US because of the disparity of revenues. Mrs. Cohen said that, strangely enough, the disparity of revenues were before the crisis. Yes, of course, it was before because it is the cause. And usually the cause are before the consequences. Because the disparity of revenues created a very tragic paradox that was important to raise profits, to have low revenues, but you have low revenues, you don't have purchase of power and consumption. And the only way to maintain the consumption power of people was to have, as it was very often in the past, even in Amsterdam in the 16th century, bubbles, asset values increase, bubbles in the housing market and bubbles in the Wall Street. And that bubbles, as we all know, created a way to increase the value, sell the assets, make profit, use part of the profit for consumption, part of the profit to buy higher houses, etc., etc. That can't last forever. That is really the cause of a crisis. The impossibility of having a fair distribution of revenues and artificial revenues through the financial sector, even for the very poor, subprime, where you maintain consumption. And I was told once that the Europeans are the cause of the crisis because they were silly enough to buy the subprime securitizations. I was said that by an American economist, and I really think that the maximum of bad faith. Third, that's the cause of the crisis. Third, the management of a crisis. management of a crisis since the beginning of it was a disaster, both in the US, in Japan, and in Europe. Because we managed a crisis caused by an excess of debt in increasing the debts, which was amazing. At that time, I compared the new G20 as a meeting of people drinking too much alcohol. They meet, they say, we swear we are not going to drink anymore. And to congratulate, let's take a last glass. I said that at the first G20, and unfortunately, they still are drinking as they did last week. Fourth, the situation in Europe is not worse than the situation in US. Far from that. Look at the figures. Our GDP is much higher. Our public debt is much lower. Our economic growth is equal. Our unemployment is lower because if you name a number which is, in my view, wrong, the real American unemployment is 16%, not 8%, because you do not take into account the people that are out of the market. And this is agreed by the OECD and even by the American Central Bank statistics. Take all of the figures you want. We are better than the US, we European. GDP per capita, life expectancy, which is growing in Europe and declining in the US. Balance of payment. We have a positive balance of payment in Europe. You have a negative, tragic balance of payment in the US. What is the difference between the US and Europe? You in the US, you represent 45% of the defense budget of the world, and it's fine. We need that. But we don't have that, and we don't have that spending. And that spending gives you the right to receive, and that's good, I don't criticize that, to receive a lot of money coming from outside, and the fact that you have a dollar as one of the main currency. By the way, euro is growing and will represent more than 25% of the reserve of the world, which is not so bad for a currency created only 15 years ago. And I would add also, of course, a second difference, which is fundamental, which is the key answer to my dear friend, Jacob. You have a federal state. We don't have that. That's the key difference. And my key answer to that is that either we'll have a federal state in the next months, years, decade, I don't know, or the euro will disappear and the Europe will collapse. That's the key point. That's my fifth point. We try to build a federal state bottom up. Nobody did that in the past. That's very difficult. My sixth point is that the mismanagement of a crisis is a disaster. We never try, we had elections going from one time to another, people are never bold enough. And then, as always, when you don't take a decision, you postpone it by increasing the debt. Actually, I think that the real economic doctrine in charge of the world economy and European economy today is not Keynes, neither Schumpeter, it's Mr. Madoff who is in charge. Whatever we do, it's Madoff, postponed by debt. 7, what is missing is clear. 6, I'm still in the 6th point. What is the worst case scenario? It's clear, the worst case scenario has already begun. No reform in Europe, no move towards a federal state, and therefore Greece is agonizing, Spain is agonizing, Italy is agonizing, Germans will understand that their own situation is very bad because their demography is a catastrophe, their public debt is equal to the others, and then people will begin to say, oh, I want to think to myself, and then that's the end, as it was in 1910, when people react to a crisis by protectionism, by selfishness. That can happen. Don't forget that Europe commits suicide 4 times in the 20th century. That can happen again. That's the worst case scenario. And I think that the most worst case scenario is still quite possible. It's a matter of realizing the risk, and I am not sure that they are all of them realized the risk. What is missing? A federal state. And it's not very difficult to do it. It's just a matter of moving from a technocratic federalism we have now, which is a federalism by states, by commission, technocrats, and by the central bank. We have a central bank. We have a federalism, technocracy by the central bank, to a political federalism by adding to that a capacity to have Eurobonds, project bonds, investment, capacity of Europe. Europe as an entity has no debt, zero debt. Of course, he has zero revenue, then it's normal. But if Europe can get a revenue for itself, it can borrow, according to the markets, 5 trillion euros. And that is not difficult technically. It is not difficult. It is a matter of political will. Let me remember that's my 8 point. What happened in the US? In the US, there is a very important dinner that took place one day between 3 persons, where they have a question of, do we move to a federal state or not? This dinner took place July 26, 1790, 1790. It's a very important, maybe the most important dinner in the history of Americans. That dinner was at a moment where the Americans were threatened by a new attack by the British Army. The French withdrew because of the French Revolution. The Americans were alone. All the provinces were full of debt. They have no central government, and exactly as in Europe today, they were collapsing. 3 people met, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton. A fascinating dinner. We know everything about that dinner. What happened after? They decide, one, to create a capital city, named after the old man, Washington, who was in New York that day, but not part of the dinner. And second, to create the treasury bonds, to borrow money to buy the weapons to win the battle against the British. And they did, and they win, and they create the United States. If that dinner didn't take place or didn't succeed, United States will be in the same position that after the Bolivar mistakes of South America. A collapse of it's exactly the situation in Europe today. Are we going to have Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton? I'm not sure. That's a matter of more political diplomacy than political economy, but it's clearly the question. And 10th point is, Europe is a lesson for the world. What is really most important reason for the crisis today is that we have a globalization of markets without globalization of rule of laws. In Europe, we try to go from globalization of market to globalization of rule of law, common market, single currency, federal state. That was forecast, that was in the agenda. We need to do that, but it's also the same at the world level. If we keep on having globalization of markets without globalization of rule of law, what will be the consequence? We'll have what is in the textbooks of markets, globalization, free markets, but free markets need rights, which means police, justice, state to establish a property rights. If not, what happened? What is the only example of what we have a globalization without rule of law? It's a country without a state, Somalia. Globalization is Somalization of the world. It's exactly what is happening. That may happen to Europe, we try to avoid, but if we do not succeed in Europe, it's difficult to think that we will succeed in the world. Before to conclude, I would just make a last joke, maybe to introduce the next speaker. I'm sure that everyone in this room knows that story. It's 2 Jews, old Jews, after a long history in Europe, and they are somewhere in Peru one day, or in Bolivia, or in any other country of Latin America, on a Sunday afternoon, and they look at a newspaper, and one of the 2 Jews say to the other, have you seen Peru has won against Brazil 2-0. And after a long silence, the second say, is it good for us?